Good morning. Can you hear me now?
Yes, good morning.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Friday, February 5th, Faculty Spotlight. I am Linda Jackson, and I am the Senior Director for Sponsored Research and Programs, and I am your new host of the Faculty Development or the Faculty Spotlight series. And so I'm excited to be able to be a part of this experience. I participated, as many of you, on Fridays to hear about the wonderful work and the specificity of our faculty. So today I have the honor and being the host for Dr. Kevin Webster, who is someone I've worked with over the past months, and he's very acquainted with the work that I do. And I'm somewhat acquainted, I thought, with the work that he does until I read his bio. And then I completely said, I don't know this person. And so today I get a chance to, like you, get to learn a little bit about our faculty spotlight person. And so I received a wonderful bio brief, Dr. Webster, on you, and I'm very impressed. In another life, I did practice clinical psychotherapy, but you put rings and circles around anything and everything I thought I knew. But
Apples and oranges for sure, Dr. Jackson.
well, now I know who I can actually talk to and maybe even get some therapy when I need it. Uh, But Dr. Webster, you are currently the assistant professor and chair of the Department of Psychology here at Virginia Union University in Richmond, Virginia, for those of you who are tuning in who are not from the campus area. And he received his PhD in experimental psychology from one of our local colleges here, Virginia Commonwealth University, VCU, in 2016. His dissertation work, which is extremely impressive, is on behavioral pharmacological and behavioral phenotyping with a focus on neuropsychiatric disorders and the pharmacological treatments of them. I mean, I barely could get the words out, and I did have to get a dictionary.
Hey,
But
you're going to be better at Scrabble now.
really, and I can even spell them, so that's a
Yeah.
good sign. Projects included investigations of genetic influence of anterior lateral sclerosis and schizophrenia, examining differences in interoceptive cues of antipsychotic medication across inbreed mouse strains, and elucidation of the antidepressant effects of ketamine. Dr. Webster began teaching at Virginia Union as an adjunct person in 2014, a short 6 years ago, and then joined the Panther family as a full-time department chair in 2018, and we did a celebration around that. Dr. Webster has served as secretary for the Faculty Senate since 2019 and has chaired the School of Arts and Sciences Curriculum Review Committee since 2020. He has also developed a course in behavioral pharmacological and assisted in developing a minor in neuroscience with the Department of Natural Sciences. You have been very busy. Dr. Webster, this is a very short 30 minutes, and we just have to condense all that what I just read into 30 minutes. But we're going to get started because we're anxious to hear about you. And so can you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your academic training, and your field of expertise, your specificity?
Sure. So my journey kind of began, my journey in psychology kind of began in high school. I remember, being interested in psychology and wanting to be involved in the field in some way, shape, or form, relatively early on, maybe my sophomore year of high school. And at least at the time, my rationale was that, people find it easy to talk to me. I'm a good listener. And I've got enough crazy friends that if I ever go into a clinical practice, I'll be in business for the rest of my life. And so with that in mind, when I entered VCU, I applied to be a psychology major. But in my first couple of years, my first couple of semesters at the university taking psychology classes, I was a little let down. I was taking courses in a variety of subdisciplines, developmental psychology, clinical psychology, social psychology. But personally, it was kind of hard for me to differentiate not necessarily one class from the other, but the common themes, seem to have a huge amount of overlap between the fields. And I just, like I said, I wasn't really, my spark hadn't been lit. The spring semester of my sophomore year, I remember I took a class called physiological psychology. And that, some fellow colleagues, some fellow students had kind of warned me, hey, this is a really tough class, yada, yada, yada. But it seemed interesting. It was all about the brain and, the biology of a lot of what we had talked about in other classes. I kind of didn't know any better. So I said, sure, let's just dive right into it and see how it goes. I ended up falling in love with the class. I've never, it was one of the first classes where I did all of, read the textbook essentially cover to cover. I really felt like what we were talking about in class was had a direct link to was a real explanation of the phenomena that we talk about in psychology. I just, like I said, I just fell in love with the class, and I really felt that it had ignited my academic spark. I remember on the end, when I took the final for that course, after I finished it, I kind of flipped it over and wrote a nice long note to the professor expressing how much I enjoyed the course and how much, it was important to me, and kind of saying, hey, if I know you do research on the VCU campus. If you have any openings in your laboratory, I would love to come shadow over the summer. I would love to come watch, just kind of reaching out to try to get research experience. The graduate student who was reading those or grading those tests and actually running the lab at the time saw my note, sent me an email and invited me in. And the rest is kind of history. I ended up working in that lab for starting from the summer of my the summer before my junior year through the rest of my undergraduate career. I worked there for a gap year after I'd finished my undergrad. And that was actually the lab that I ended up working in for my thesis and dissertation work. I realized kind of by the end of it that I think I had spent, all in total, I think I'd spent close to 10 years in that laboratory, which considering at the time of my graduation, I still wasn't 30 yet. That was a big influence on who I was as a person, what kind, the way I saw the world around me, and just kind of really shaped me into the person that I am today. Like you heard in the introduction, a lot of my research expertise was in animal models. That was kind of one of the most exciting things about working in that lab, was that it was a rodent lab. We worked with mice and rats, and since it was largely a behavior lab, it wasn't quite so, we weren't doing surgeries, we weren't doing some of the slightly more gruesome things, I'll say. It was kind of, in a way, it was like playing with mice and rats each day. And I'm sure if we could see the cameras of the audience, I'm sure there'd be some shudders in there. But they get a little cuter, Some people don't like cats, but to my cat people out there, anyway. Yeah, and so that was my expertise. That is my expertise still. That's where the majority of my academic training is. My focus since coming to Union has shifted slightly. And so now I'm much more focused on undergraduate research and just trying to find ways to get undergraduates involved and exposed to experimentation. A lot of the students here at Union, similar to myself when I joined, when I started VCU, a lot of the students here really think about psychology only as the therapeutic angle. And while that is important, and while I think it's especially important for us to, help train the next generation, especially of Black psychologists, I do want to open up, I do want to expose students to the opportunities out there and help them to realize that, research in psychology, isn't just limited to humans and doesn't necessarily have to be limited to, and you don't have to be limited to kind of the clinical aspect of it. So that's where I've shifted my focus more to since I've come to Union. But I've always had the love for, kind of my first love for biopsychology, neuroscience, and especially, the importance of animal behavior in even these molecular and kind of, very molecular and cellular studies of how the brain works, how the brain leads to behavior, things like that.
Wow. Well, you started the conversation with saying how you have friends that can tap into you whenever they need to because you're a good listener, or you can add me to that because I'm sure there's a psychology around the fact that since the pandemic, I have not worn a pair of heels. And I
Mm-hmm.
know there's something about that, some psychology around that. So we'll be talking. But
Fair enough. Yeah.
so you gave us a safe way, though, into some of what you shared. I think we'll be interested now in hearing a little bit about what are you teaching currently at VUU, at Virginia Union?
So I'm a little bit, I don't want to say all over the place, but as many of the other chairs of the department or in the School of Arts and Sciences and the university as a whole, I kind of tend to switch hats in what I'm teaching. This semester, I'm teaching two courses. I'm teaching an introduction to psychology, um, teaching an introduction to psychology course. Those are always just fun because um, I'll come back to that story in a second. So, teaching an introduction to psychology course and my course that I just got formalized last year, behavioral pharmacology, which is a study of, basically when you take a drug, whether that is a therapeutic drug that was prescribed to you by your doctor, whether that's a aspirin pill that you bought at the CVS, or whether that is a drug of abuse that an addict takes, while they're in the grips of their disorder. How does that drug work in our bodies? And, really going into what brain areas are affected, how our neurotransmitters changed. Again, a lot more of that, molecular and cellular explanation of behavior and how drugs and behavior interact. Um, I do always love to teach introduction to psychology courses because in my mind, those are a bit more of a performance art than they are a rigorous academic course. Of course, we have learning objectives and things we want to achieve. But at that level, you're really just trying to, put on a show and kind of say, these are the most interesting things. These are the things that, you've always been doing, but never really thought about or recognized that you're doing them. And uh, one of my favorite explanations of that, or kind of pieces of that, is this idea that all humans are psychologists. Whether you've had training in psychology, whether you've taken a course in psychology, every single person has what we in the field called a folk psychological knowledge, right? And I promise I'm not going to make this a whole 30-minute lecture, but just really briefly, when you pour sugar into your coffee, right? What happens to it? It dissolves, right? It goes away. Do you think about, well, the fact that the hot water in your coffee is breaking apart the bonds of the sugar molecules, and they're able to display, nobody thinks of the chemistry behind why sugar dissolves in your coffee, right? It just happens, right? But if your best friend, Dr. Jackson, comes up to you and says, I haven't worn heels since the beginning of the pandemic, what's going on? There is that we all kind of naturally think, hey, here's another person that I know, I care about, I want to figure out why they're acting this way, because maybe it's beneficial for me. If I know that whenever Dr. Jackson, wears certain earrings, she's in a good mood, I'm more likely to go to her and talk to her about, my grant submission that day. It may be for the, reciprocity of another person. If I know that, and Dr. Jackson, I'm using you're a person right in front of me, so it's kind of all I can think about. If she's having a bad day and I can kind of help cheer her up, then that strengthens the social bonds that we have, right? And again, you don't need to take a class to be doing those things, right? This is something that we all do So especially in a Psych 101 class, it's kind of fun because it's like, hey, here is the phenomena that you've always done, but you've never, had the scientific explanation of. It's a lot of Psych 101 is really, putting names and phenomena onto, like I said, things that we do every day.
And actually, that was going to be one of my questions to you. And,
Mm-hmm.
what was your experience as a faculty like? But I think you really start hitting on it when you just made us all aware that you're aware
Mm-hmm.
of all of us and how we may look or posture ourselves, or, our tone even
Mm-hmm.
is suggestive of how someone may be receptive to you and how you may need to approach them.
Yeah.
So yes, I enjoy this. This is so wonderful.
Excellent.
So I'm going to ask you another question. This may be a little more on a scholarly level because we want to dig a little deeper.
Sure.
So this is the question. You talked about your projects have included investigation of genetic influence on conditions like sclerosis and schizophrenia,
Mm-hmm.
and the effects of antidepressants and antipsychotics.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a bit about your research and your scholarship in that arena.
Sure. So the laboratory that I worked in under the tutelage and principal investigation of Joseph Porter, it was his main focus. A lot of what his research focuses around is a drug known as clozapine. Clozapine is an atypical antipsychotic, so it's a newer generation drug given to people who are dealing with schizophrenia, and it's really one of the better drugs out there for helping most people deal with the disorder, right? Get through day-to-day life and not, experience the hallucinations, delusions that they, do while they're having an episode or while they're in an episode of the disorder. So it's a behavioral pharmacology lab. So looking at, how do animals change or how do animals act differently when we give them drugs, and then trying to say, okay, we know these drugs affect these type of neurotransmitters. How can we then relate the change in neurotransmitters brought on by the drug to the change in behavior that we see in the animal? So my thesis work focused on looking at differences between different strains of mice and how they responded to clozapine. In research, we usually use inbred strains of animals, and this is not a Game of Thrones thing. It is, they do that because inbred animals are genetically similar. So you'll get 30, 40 mice for an experiment, and those mice are all brothers and sisters of one another, and you know that to a certain extent, their genes are going to be the same. That's important because if you see a difference in behavior between animal number 1 and animal number 3, you know that that's not because of their underlying genomics. That's due to an experimental condition you gave them, something, there's something else going on other than kind of the background effects. So by looking at different mouse strains and how they respond differently, this helped us to apply this work more to humans, because as we know, each individual human has their own unique genetic thumbprint. And so by understanding how each different mouse strain responded differently to this drug, we can understand, okay, is this result we saw in one strain specific to that one strain, or is there some part of it that is general to all animals of that type? And it also helps us to understand a little bit more about the underlying genetics of each mouse strain itself. Right? These mice are made, but we don't really have a sequence of their genome. So information like receptor expression, other biological factors like that aren't readily available. So this was a way for us to kind of backwardsly try to understand some of that and try to develop some of that information. The work, so that was most of my thesis work, looking at differences in drug responses in different strains of animals. My dissertation work was focused on behavioral phenotyping of a gene involved in schizophrenia. So essentially, there is definitely a genetic component to schizophrenia. If your mother or father has schizophrenia, you're more likely to have it than, say, if your uncle, aunt, or grandparent has it. There's a really nice, the closer a family member is to you, they share more genes with you, and the more likely you are to get schizophrenia. But researchers in the late 90s, early 2000s came to a pretty definitive, pretty definitively said, well, there is this genetic component, but there is no one schizophrenic gene. And so what researchers identified through looking at a bunch of people with schizophrenia, figuring out what they're, looking at their genomics, was that there's a lot of different risk genes. And so the quest then became, let's look at each of these risk genes individually and see, does this contribute to schizophrenia? Does it not? Is this real? Is this noise, etc.? So my dissertation used a knockout mouse model. So basically we identified a gene that we were interested in. This gene was VMAT1. It's a vesicular monoamine transporter gene. Basically, I know I'm going too deep, helps to bring neurotransmitters into vesicles, these little pockets that help to store and help release the neurotransmitters. We identified this gene had been identified as a risk gene. So we said, okay, here are normal mice that are, they just exist. And then we developed a knockout strain of mice where we're able to identify that VMAT1 gene in their genome and essentially remove it. So these animals never expressed the VMAT1 gene. They never made the associated protein with it. They were born essentially similar to people who had schizophrenia with a misfunctioning copy of this part of their genome. We then ran them through a bunch of tests that modeled schizophrenia. Mice don't get schizophrenia, but there are some behavioral tests that we can run that suggest schizophrenia or a schizophrenic phenotype. And so my dissertation essentially was looking at how do animals with the gene and how do animals without the gene differ in their behaviors. And what we essentially found was that animals with the knockouts, so animals who had the non-functioning version of the gene, acted more schizophrenic or performed in behavioral tests suggesting that they were more likely to display schizophrenic symptoms if this were to happen in a human as well. And then I think there was one other thing. Similar thing with with ALS, the Lou Gehrig's disorder. That was a contract that we had gotten to do some behavioral work for someone at the MCV campus. Same idea there. They identified a risk gene in ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And we were, again, testing those animals, seeing how their muscle grip and other muscular physical features worked as these animals age with or without this gene.
Wow. So, and I know that could take another whole hour to really dive even deeper into your dissertation and your specifics to your research. I do have a couple more questions. We're nearing the hour for coming to an end, and I believe we have some Q&A. So I'm going to really try to squeeze it all in because the questions that I see are, we want to hear the answers from you in particular. But I guess I had two questions, but I'll tell it because I was interested in how the conversation came about for you to create the course that you did with the National Science Department. I was interested in that, but I would be remiss if I didn't ask you what advice would you give for those considering a major or minor or degrees in psychology?
Sure. So psychology is an amazing major, and psychology is okay. So I guess my best sell is that psychology is a major that really, no matter what you want to do, you can find some way, shape, or form that psychology can help you. If you're interested in, behavior and biology and how the brain works, it's definitely important to take those, chemistry, biology classes. But again, the goal is whole animal behavior. So understanding how to understand behavior, how to analyze it is important. If you want to go into any kind of service industry, advertising, direct personal service, Again, understanding how to read people, how to trying to put yourself in those people's shoes. That's a really great. That's a really good way to look at it. Even things like literature and language and arts. In order to make the perfect art piece that inspires emotions in other people, you've in a way got to understand what those emotions are, how we classify those, what brings those on in people, maybe even the brain regions involved in those. So yeah, if you're interested in psychology, if you're interested in clinical or biological or clinical work especially, it's a great field to come into. But even if you have kind of a passing interest, or you are looking for something, I don't quite want to say if you're undecided, come to us. But if you're not quite sure, psychology is a great basis, because you can kind of use that and branch out into whatever becomes interesting to you as you continue your career at Virginia Union.
I ditto that. Absolutely. It's just great to have
Mhm.
at least a couple courses around it.
Sure.
It does open up your thinking and your mind. We have a few minutes left.
Mhm.
Wes, this is my first time for Wes. Aiden, this is my first time navigating Zoom. I do want to home in on some of the Q&A if possible. So can I just go to the Q&A?
Yes, absolutely. You're able to just click on the Q&A poll at the bottom of the screen. Should be
Okay, I
two speech
got
bubbles.
so. I want to entertain a few of these, and so Professor Ragland, you probably know in the National Sciences Department, she's in the math department. But her question was, Dr. Webster, did you hesitate to take the psychology class when others painted the class based on their experience? And what advice did you give your majors about taking different psychology courses?
So that's a great question, Professor Reckman. First off, thanks for asking that one. I think it's important to, we are social creatures, and so we do, take the advice of others, especially those that we trust, seriously. It's important to us. But I also think that it's important to, when you go into any experience, to go in with an open mind. I like I said, others had kind of said, hey, this is a really tough class. This is, is the physiological psych. This is this difficult course. But, for me, I don't want to say it wasn't difficult. Again, that was probably the course in undergrad that I put the most work into. I probably shouldn't say this, but I wasn't the best student in undergrad. And so, to find a course that I enjoyed and, doing the reading, it really motivated me to learn and to kind of get into, put the effort into it necessary. I kind of tried to go in with as few expectations as possible. And because of that, I feel like I could, I could kind of more adjust to the situation and adjust to, the challenges that course faced me with, which, in the end ended up giving me a really, really rewarding experience. I ended up getting an A by the skin of my teeth. It came down to the final exam in that course. But when I got an A in that course, especially after hearing how difficult it was from everyone else, and especially not viewing myself as this, phenomenal student who's going to, ace this course because I'm just a genius, it was really fulfilling, and it was really awesome. So, to the students here, in my department and outside, be wary. If you hear a course or a particular professor is difficult, sure, guard yourself a little bit more, but also, live your own life. What one person finds difficult, another one finds as easy as drawing breath. And I think if we can apply any lessons from the larger world, to this, it's, people see things differently, people react to things differently, and each person has their own experiences. So don't let prejudgment or what you've heard from other people ruin your chances to really be inspired or excited or really enjoy something just because you've heard it's hard.
All right, so one more, and I need
Yeah.
the bridge version for me.
Okay, I promise.
So Dr. Vernon Ruffin has asked, so is the idea to do gene therapy for humans who have these diseases?
So it does kind of depend on the disease. With something like schizophrenia, with so many, individual risk genes, it would be difficult to use a gene therapy, say like the newly developed CRISPR, to fix these genetic abnormalities because again, just because a gene is involved in schizophrenia doesn't mean that it's only schizophrenic, right? In many ways, the genes that are involved in these disorders have a completely different job, but it's the dysfunction of the job they're doing which is causing all the symptoms we're seeing, right? Oh my gosh, I just had a really great example of this idea and I've lost it, but I'm not going to spend time on it because we're running out of time. So the idea is not necessarily to do gene therapy, or at least not yet, because but it's more to learn about, is this gene actually involved? And what does that gene do? Because if we find that all the genes that are involved in schizophrenia all deal with, say, vesicle function, then we can get a better idea of, hey, it's something when the vesicles don't work as they will, or something when, some part of the brain or the neuron doesn't work as it will, that we need to focus on. Okay, I promise I'll keep this quick. A lot of people, the common idea for what was causing schizophrenia was dopamine hyperactivity. And so a lot of the drug, and that's because a lot of the drugs that treat schizophrenia will kind of reduce dopamine activity. But recent research has shown that change in dopamine, a neurotransmitter, is really driven by changes in glutamate, which is a kind of a more basic neurotransmitter that has a much wider influence in the brain itself. So in the past, like 10 years or so, researchers have really changed their focus of what's causing schizophrenia to this glutamate hypothesis versus the dopamine hypothesis, which has existed since the 70s.
Wow, this is worthy of a part two. We're always interested in learning more about ourselves, because psychology just taps on all of us who are on Zoom today, and just to learn a little bit more about ourselves and the people we work with, the people we live with, the people we interact with. Dr. Webster, it has been a joy today to spend this 30 minutes with you. We have learned a lot in such a short period of time, even though many of us were very nervous when we start reading about what your expertise is in, but we got a chance to glean from you, and for that we're very thankful. Thank you all for coming today and being a part of the Faculty Spotlight. We look forward to the next time. Enjoy, stay safe, and be well.
If I could give a really quick shout out, I'd like to point out two members of the chat, Wayne and Donna Jo Webster. That's my mom and dad. Hey, mom and dad, thanks for tuning in. Hey, and I love you guys. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Be safe. Be well. Thank you all.